This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Hey, what's up, and welcome to Q&A, the show where I take your questions from YouTube and Twitter and answer them here in video format. A ton of questions to get into, so let's just jump into it and start with our first question from Christopher Zielinski, who says, how do you think the amount of injuries sustained by the Browns this season change how the Browns structure their roster going forward? I don't really think it changes anything about how the Browns structure their roster. Like, if anything, they got reinforced in how they structure their roster is pretty good given the result of the team, right? You can't be stress test, or a roster template can't be stress test more than this. Now, when it comes to injuries that could hamper a player's ability to ever return, I don't think that that's where we're at. Like, Nick Chubb has probably the scariest injury of anybody. Deshaun Watson, because it's a shoulder surgery and it's a quarterback, you always worry about that. But other than that, like, as far as the structure of the roster goes, I mean, if you went 8-5 with this amount of injuries, would you really change the structure of the roster? It's not like that's what caused the injuries. Football caused the injuries. And sometimes you get the bad draw in football and you get the more injuries than usual. And this is just what's happening to them. But they've been able to withstand that blow pretty successfully throughout the year. So I wouldn't change anything. Next question comes from Kusais, who says, why do you think Stefanski didn't give these play calls to Deshaun Watson or DTR? I feel like Watson would have thrived in a throw-first offense, and he might have even stayed healthy. It's not about the play calls. It's just about play style, right? And it's about luck, too. Like, when Watson was in there and when DTR was in there, they were playing defenses that were not biting on the play action. Just flat out weren't. Joe FLACCO gets in there and teams start biting on the play action. Maybe because they don't respect FLACCO as a threat. Maybe because they're not afraid of FLACCO pulling that out and running it the opposite way on the bootleg. Maybe that has something to do with it. But, you know, they called the same plays. They just weren't hitting for the same amounts because defenses were playing it more disciplined. For whatever reason, FLACCO got in there and teams started busting coverages. Like, you've seen the touchdowns. It's not like he's throwing the covered receivers and throwing guys open. They're wide open because the coverages are busted or because they're biting on these fakes super hard. And that's just something that wasn't happening earlier in the year. So, these play calls were in with Watson, with DTR. They called them. Just defenses did a better job of defending them than the last 2 weeks here. So that's really what I think is happening there. I think it would be making too much of it to suggest otherwise. Gus says, do you think Watson plays better after he gets hit? I don't know. That seems like a silly thing. I think Watson just plays better as the game goes on, right? Like, he usually gets hit early in a game and then he plays better later in a game. He's just kind of a guy who plays better as the game goes on. But you could say the same thing about, like, Joe Burrow, right? Joe Burrow is not somebody known for coming out guns blazing most of the time. Most of the time he does his best work in the second half. So some quarterbacks just play better in the second half of games. Seems like Deshaun Watson's one of those guys who plays better in the second half of games. And if you had to pick a half where a player would play well, you would probably want it to be in the second half. The next question comes from Jacob, who says, who do you think the front office will pick when it comes time, JOK or Greg Newsome? Who says they'll have to choose? Real question. Who says they'll have to choose? We're just kind of assuming that they're going to have to choose. But we've been doing these false choices with guys on this roster. Who are they going to keep? Denzel Ward or Myles Garrett? They kept both of them. Who are they going to keep? Jack Conklin or Wyatt Teller? They kept both of them. Oh, man, there's no way you keep Amari Cooper and David Njoku. Yeah, you kept both of them. Who's to say they're not going to find a way to keep both? I wouldn't bet against it. If they want to keep both, they'll find a way to keep both. And that's just kind of how it goes. I don't think that those two are juxtaposed each other. Oliver Kane says, do you think it's best we extend Flacco to remain in the locker room next year, given the expertise and leadership abilities? I hear maybe Deshaun wouldn't want. Okay. All right. See, this is the shit, man. What has Flacco done that makes us think that like what's happening right now is like due to his expertise and leadership abilities? He's just playing some good games at quarterback, y'all. And as far as a leadership standpoint goes, this team was responding extremely well to Deshaun Watson's leadership. Like, I don't think that that's a problem. You cannot like Deshaun Watson as a person off the field, but like his teammates love him. The team responds to his leadership. I don't really think that like Joe Flacco's doing anything that anybody else isn't doing. This is just this thing where we like, I'm gonna use a new word here. It's just that thing where we rizz up guys like because they're new. But if we give them like all these extra tags, like, oh, look at the leadership ability. The leadership was pretty good when Deshaun was in there. Hell, it was fine when PJ was in there. Like, it's not hard to lead when you winning games, right? Like, that's the thing. Also, this team's winning games. Ain't that hard to be the leader at quarterback? You winning. So I don't think there's really a reason to keep him. And honestly, I don't really anticipate that being an option because I would imagine that Flacco will retire after this run. He doesn't scream to me want to play another year. And if he plays so good, he'll probably have to sign somewhere else. Like, I just think that there are other factors into it. And I don't really think if Deshaun's your starter, and Deshaun is a veteran quarterback, there's really no reason to have another veteran quarterback there to mentor Deshaun. Like, that doesn't read right. And that's honestly just putting him in a position to where people are going to act kind of ridiculous about it. And that's not a spot to put your quarterback in the best level of success, right? You don't want to make it seem like you're not committed to your franchise quarterback, because that kind of wavering on your commitment can be seen as a negative, and that can have very negative effects in the locker room and at quarterback in general. And if this team's still committed to Deshaun, which contract says that they are, in which last time we heard Kevin talked, he called him the franchise quarterback. Nothing's changed since Deshaun won that game in Baltimore. Then I don't think that they'll keep Joe Flacco as the backup regardless of how the season ends. Danny says, what happens if Joe balls out and Watson comes back and underperforms? So like if you're saying like if Joe Flacco balls out for the rest of the season and then Watson performs at the start of the season, I mean, a lot of fans are going to complain, but like virtually nothing changes. Deshaun's going to be the starter. Like I don't know what to tell you. Like, fans are going to complain. They're going to do the same shit they did with Josh Dobbs earlier this year, or name your guy, or with Baker Mayfield, or whoever the flavor of the month has been for the anti-Watson fans in the fan base. They're going to root for that guy. Joe Flacco is going to end up being the guy that they put in that position now, right? They had to change out the pedestal like 4 different times. It'll be Joe Flacco in that pedestal now. And then they'll complain about Deshaun. But like, is that really any different than what we've dealt with the last year and a half? Like, hasn't the last year and a half been Watson underperforming slightly and then people wanting Baker Mayfield back, right? 2 years ago. And then this year, oh man, Josh Dobbs, and like all these weird arguments, right? So nothing's going to change if that happens, if I'm being real with you, Nanny. It's weird that we're getting this amount of questions. I appreciate Joe Flacco playing well, but Joe Flacco hasn't played so well that he's going to replace your starter. That's kind of ridiculous. Austin, does all the injuries in free agents change the Browns draft and free agency plan in the offseason, signing / not signing some guys back drafting certain positions over other. No, I don't really think so. None of these injuries were career altering. Like maybe running back, but the Browns have already tried to prepare for running back. So maybe they add some more emphasis in running back. Maybe they invest more in a true backup running back, or they invest more in the offensive line. But I really don't think that anything's changed drastically with the Browns planning because of the injuries. If Flacco makes a playoff run, do the Browns let him go to free agency or sign him as a backup next year and find a place for DTR on the practice squad or otherwise? I mean, Flacco's probably going to make a playoff run, but the question is, like, is it like if Joe Flacco throws for like 14 touchdowns in the last 6 games and like maybe 4 interceptions, and then you make the playoffs and you're like, okay, then he took you to the playoffs, right? At that point, that's a level of quarterback play that would suggest that. Then you have a more interesting conversation, I guess, if he decides he wants to come back. But outside of anything like that, we kind of know what the story is. If Joe Flacco gets to the playoffs, it's because the defense got them to the playoffs. And if the defense can get Joe Flacco to the playoffs, they can probably get Deshaun Watson to the playoffs. This defense carried PJ Walker to a win over the 49ers. You could probably do the same thing with DTR, right? So I don't really see the reason. Like, I don't know how we keep coming out of this and not learning the lesson is that the defense is good enough that like the backup quarterback conversation is actually kind of like not as relevant as people want it to be. Because we did this with Josh Dobbs. Oh, man, you could have kept Josh Dobbs. But the defense carried you through all them games that Josh Dobbs would have played, and you won most of them anyways. So it ended up not mattering. And then Deshaun gets hurt. The defense carries you through a game with DTR. Ends up not mattering that you don't have Josh Dobbs. And then Joe Flacco comes in there, plays well, but ultimately the game that we won, defense had 3 interceptions in, right? Like, the defense is going to carry you wherever you need to go. I really don't think it matters as much who the backup is. The Browns have had 4 in. They've won with all 4. And it's not because we running magical plays at quarterback. It's just because the defense is what's going to carry whoever the backup is. And David Njoku, and hopefully Nick Chubb, and Amari Cooper, or whoever is at wide receiver. So I think we've proven that the Browns have a decent enough structure in place that they could survive a quarterback injury without having to have a superstar backup, right? So I don't really think that they would do that. And on top of it, you know, you got to play the human game, right? You can't just play Madden here. If you have Flacco as a backup, we know how people are acting about Joe Flacco. That's going to create its own environment. And that's not going to be what's the best. That's not going to be the best environment for this team to thrive under. Like, people trying to force a quarterback controversy tends to not be a great environment for teams to thrive in. So I would avoid it at all costs. If you're truly committed to Deshaun Watson, then you got to be truly committed to Deshaun Watson and make sure that nobody gets any ideas about there being a quarterback competition in any way once he comes back. People might not like that answer, but that's the truth. And if you want this team to be successful next year, you can't play around and act like there's a quarterback competition, because if they do that, we're going to be sitting here and it's going to feel like 2019 all over again, right? Where we're like, oh, can't do it. Can't do it. Got to commit to whoever's at quarterback. Got to, or else you end up with a goofy situation. And right now, Deshaun Watson has that $230 million guaranteed contract. Until somebody says otherwise, that's who they're committed to. And even like, let's live in a world, a world where, like, let's say instead of Flacco balling out, it was DTR, and DTR balled out, and the team decided they wanted to go with DTR for the rest of the time, right? That's our guy. He's franchise DTR. You do realize if they went that way, Deshaun Watson would not ever dress a game for the Cleveland Browns again, whether he's under contract or not. Like, there would be no world where DTR is starting and Deshaun's just holding the clipboard, holding it down for the homie. Like, if you are going to go with a DTR, you got to get rid of Deshaun in some way, shape, or form. And if you're going to go with Deshaun, you got to get rid of anybody that anybody else is going to push for to be the starter. You got to make sure there's no confusion there. There's no mistake. When they traded for Deshaun, they got rid of Baker, and Baker never stepped foot in that building again. because there can't be this optic of there being a quarterback competition. You have to be committed to whoever the starter is, because you don't have successful seasons when you're out here trying to pit two guys against each other and you allow it to fester by not making it extremely clear. Not just saying Deshaun's our starter, like making it extremely clear that that's the starter and at no point are we pulling him. You got to make a commitment, man. And keeping Flacco on the roster, that's a sign that you don't want to make a commitment. And if they do something like that, I'll be concerned about the direction of next year, because that's something that doesn't usually ever work out. It's going to create chaos. So you got to make a commitment. And given that I don't think the Browns are going to throw out Deshaun Watson's contract to put it all on Joe Flacco, it tells you where you're going there, right? And it might be a non-factor because Flacco might retire. Roger Yates says, I know you can't teach Flacco to run like DW4, but can Deshaun Watson learn to be an under-center play action pass quarterback? No. He's never going to play just like Joe Flacco. And Joe Flacco's never going to play just like, your play style is natural. You can't force your play style to be anything different. What the Browns need to do is commit to the play style of Deshaun Watson. They have not done a good job of doing that. Right? Like, that's the main piece of criticism that I've had for Kevin is I don't feel like they've done a good job of committing to Deshaun's specific and unique play style. I think that they've done some things to try to accommodate it, and they've put together enough so Deshaun can be pretty decent, but they haven't done enough to feel like Deshaun can be the guy that he was close to being in Houston. You got to commit to the play style. Again, this goes back to what I was talking about in the earlier question. If you're going to start somebody, you got to commit to them. And commitment is more than saying that somebody's going to be the starter. It's who you put around that starter. It's what you surround that starter with. It's the coaches. It's the offensive philosophy. It's the play calling. It's the responsibility on the line of scrimmage. You have to make that commitment. And when you've already made that commitment financially, you got to follow that through with other commitments, or else you waste your money. So what Kev and Deshaun has to do, and I think, honestly, if I'm speaking candidly, I feel like both of these guys underestimated the scope of the assignment. I think Kev underestimated how much he would have to change to adjust to Deshaun, and I think Deshaun underestimated how much he was being asked to change to play with Kevin. And I think they need to come to a better balance of that. I think Kev needs to come to a realization like, okay, I got to let go of some of this shit. Right? And I think Deshaun needs to come to a realization of, I need to pull for more of what I need in his offense, right? Because I think Deshaun was trying to be accommodating, trying to change as little bit as possible of Kevin's natural offense that he likes to run in order to try to like play along and be a good team guy. But at the end of the day, it didn't really help the team. And that awkward fit, in my opinion, is part of the reason why Deshaun has put his body in a position to get hit so much, because he's not doing what's natural, which means he's holding on to the ball even longer than he did. And he's already a naturally long holder of the football. And it's also causing him to get confused and then run instead of throwing the ball. And that puts him in a position to get hit. So some of this is them meshing styles and coming together and collaborating. But another part of this is just understanding what's the ratio on this push and pull. And, you know, organizationally, they need to figure out, is Deshaun good enough to justify that push and pull still, which we don't know. We've seen him play 11 games. He's gotten hurt. Like, it's not the best slam dunk decision, but if you're going to commit to Deshaun, you have to commit. There is no point in a half measure, right? You have to commit. Half measures always fall flat. You have to commit. Right. The same way, if DTR had balled out and threw 40 touchdowns or something in Deshaun Watson's absence, and we decided that it was a Brock Purdy situation, you got to just go with them, right? You saw what happened with Trey Lance. Trey Lance supposed to be the guy. Brock Purdy steps up, becomes the guy. Next thing you know, no more Trey Lance on the roster. You got to commit. And I don't think both sides have committed or have understood the scope of that assignment yet. And hopefully that this season they figure out how far apart they actually were and where they needed to be and where they need to meet in the middle, right? Like I hope they understand that by watching, because Kev has to see how different the offense is when Deshaun's not in there, and Deshaun has to see how quickly Kev reverts back to what he's comfortable with and how that's pulling on the things and the concepts that they're getting. Like there has to be a bit more influence there for things to be in that traditional Deshaun Watson style offense that he wants to run versus the West Coast system, which Deshaun has never been a great fit for. So it's just about finding that. And I think that these two are smart and talented enough to figure it out. But the problem also is, in my opinion, is that they're smart and talented enough to figure this out, find the right answer, and get to the place that you want it to be. But they're also smart and talented enough to work with a imperfect solution, and that solution to work well enough to where people don't make adjustments, right? Like, it's like when you're in school, the kid that gets a D is going to get more attention than the kid that gets a B minus. Because the kid that gets a B minus, like, okay, it's not bad, right? Like, it's B minus. Like, you're not really worried about that kid. But the kid that gets a D, like, hey, man, this can go away. And I think Kev and Watson can get to a part and just mesh this offense together enough to get a B minus, B minus, sometimes B plus result, kind of like what we got this year from the offense. And it's going to always feel kind of slightly underwhelming, but it'd be enough to win a bunch of games. Right. My example was kind of like Alex Smith. Like it always felt like kind of an awkward fit with Alex Smith in Kansas City, but the team was so damn good that they won like 12, 13 games all the time. So nobody really cared. And it didn't end up getting fixed until you brought a quarterback in there that was a great fit for that offense in Pat Mahomes. And that might be the case for the Browns, right? Deshaun might be a really expensive, high quality bridge quarterback for the next guy that fits whatever Kevin wants to do a little bit better, a lot better than what Deshaun is. But at the end of the day, they're both very talented, so they can make this work on some level. My question is, what level, how committed are they to that level being elite? Like how much risk are they going to be willing to take on that being an elite or very good offense, to just saying, hey, we'll do what we've been doing. You'll get more comfortable as time goes on, and I'll get more comfortable with you as time goes on, and we'll figure out how to get a B plus result out of this. Because both are likely and on the table. But that's my whole thing with the whole Watson Stefanski fit. Rendall says, hey, Q, hope you're doing well. I know it's probably late, but do you think the Browns will ever try to get Jarvis? Probably not. They weren't hit with a bunch of injuries at wide receiver. But that's it for Q&A. I appreciate every single one of you guys for coming and watching this video. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.